Okay, so it's great to be with everyone today. My name is Ari Heistein, and I had the pleasure of working on these reports with the CEP team. Today's session is going to focus on the report we published on the telecommunications industry in Yemen, which is a very unique industry in ways that make it a top priority for the Houthi regime. Next slide, please. So, at a dismal time for Yemen's economy, after more than a decade of instability, the GDP per capita stands at about $700. One of Yemen's few productive industries, energy exports, have now ground to a halt due to the Houthi policy, which says that if they don't get a cut of the proceeds, then there will be no pie. Long before Israeli shipping was targeted by the Houthis, Yemeni government shipping was targeted. The Houthis attacked ships and terminals around Yemen, which were being used to export Yemen's energy from areas under government control. And this is one of the issues which they say they want to resolve in negotiations. Until it is resolved, since this is a finite resource, the Houthis do not want to see any of Yemen's oil or gas exported. The result is, of course, increased economic pressure on the government of Yemen, which is already dependent on external sources of economic assistance for its survival. Despite the terrible economic state in Yemen, there has been a remarkable growth in the field of telecommunications. Over the course of this war, use of cell phones and the internet continues to grow. This would appear to be a positive development, involving greater access to information for Yemenis. But of course, the Houthis have found a way to leverage this to serve their extremist ends. As a side note, I want to say in no uncertain terms that the case of the telecoms industry exemplifies the reason for Yemen's economic misery more so than any Saudi bombing campaign. It would be impossible to run any sort of normal business in the Houthi-held areas where more than 20 million Yemenis live without constant shakedowns and threats of confiscation. Ultimately, their control over the use of force and exploitation of the justice system means that Yemenis under their rule are doomed to crushing poverty for the foreseeable future, regardless of how much humanitarian assistance is delivered. Any profitable industry will be extorted or expropriated by the Houthis. So, on that optimistic note, I want to do a 2-minute overview of where the telecoms industry featured in the previous webinar on terror finance and procurement. Next slide, please. So just reviewing quickly a slide from the previous webinar, you can see that Yemen's mobile network operators are involved in schemes used to raise money for terrorist groups. In this case, it's Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're essentially serving as a financial channel where the Houthis encourage the population to call or text a certain number, and then 100 riyals of their credit with that MNO are then transferred to the fundraiser. Next slide, please. In addition, on the procurement section of the previous webinar, we discussed the Houthi Ministry of Interior's former procurement chief, Abdallah al-Shair. Al-Shair was appointed by his brother to the role of chairman of several companies confiscated by the Houthis. He then squeezes the companies under his control to collect funds which are used for procurement, and at times the companies themselves may serve as fronts for procurement. As you'll see in the section of this slide with the red circle around it, telecommunications companies are also part of al-Shair's portfolio. Next slide, please. But now, zooming out, let's take a broader look at Yemen's MNOs. And what you can see here is that Yemen Mobile is the dominant player in the market, with two mid-sized competitors being Sabaphone and MTN or Utelecom. What you'll see in the next couple slides is that the Houthis have appropriated all of the major players, either in their entirety or in part, and have managed to do so in distinct ways for each company. Next slide, please. First, the most straightforward takeover was that of Yemen Mobile, as it was government controlled, and so when the Houthis took Sanaa and co-opted much of the existing government bureaucracy, it was natural that they'd also take control of the companies in which the government had a controlling stake. Yemen Mobile falls under the authority of the MTIT, or Ministry of Telecommunications and Information Technology. And so during the time of the Houthi-Saleh alliance, it was actually in the hands of people like Jlidan Mahmoud Jlidan, who are actually more Saleh loyalists than they were Houthis. After the collapse of that alliance and Saleh's assassination, Jlidan was imprisoned and replaced with a hardcore Houthi by the name of Misfer al-Numair, who continues to run the MTIT from 2017 until today. But in the Houthi worldview, it is not enough to have official bureaucratic control of an institution. It must also be infiltrated and controlled by loyalists, as if it is a hostile entity to be subverted. This is the essence of the Houthi supervisory system, and Yemen Mobile was no exception in terms of the appointment of loyalists from the most senior levels to mid-level managers. The company has been fully Houthified or Houthiized, and it now spends even beyond what it must on extortionate taxes and licensing, opting to make donations to Houthi-led public events and to fund these types of events. So while Yemen Mobile was previously viewed as the MNO that serves both Houthi-controlled and government-controlled territory, the government of Yemen has recently banned the repair or modernization of Yemen Mobile infrastructure in its territory, and this is a sign that they're looking to phase Yemen Mobile out of government-controlled territory. Next slide, please. So second, the Houthis tried to blackmail Sabaphone with an exorbitant fine in 2019. The fine was the equivalent of 100,000 times the GDP per capita of Yemen. The basis for this extortion was the claim of an illegal tax cut more than 1 decade prior. They may have been right about shady dealings in Sanaa 15 years ago. It would be hard to imagine a major company functioning in Yemen without engaging in some of that type of activity. But the fine was clearly an effort to either extort or expropriate the company, though the owners chose a third option, which was to flee Sanaa and then headquarter the company in Aden. Since then, Sabaphone has split into two. There is Sabaphone Aden and Sabaphone Sanaa. Each presumably offers services to the residents in the areas under the control of the respective governments. Sabaphone Sanaa is controlled by the former Houthi procurement chief Abdallah al-Sher, and it likely remains the larger of the two Sabaphones in light of the population differences or the difference in population size between the two territories. Since then, Sabaphone Aden's infrastructure has been targeted by Houthi military attacks, and this is part of a concerted effort to maintain the Houthi monopoly on telecommunications by preventing the emergence of companies that provide alternatives which are not under their control. Next slide, please. So third is the story of MTN, which I think is the most intriguing of the power struggles over Yemen's telecommunications infrastructure. The initial claim by anti-Houthi journalists was put out that there was some corruption involved in the 2021 acquisition of this company, but there wasn't very much detail provided. And again, I think it's pretty safe to assume that any major transaction happening in Sanaa involves some form of corruption, or there's something going on behind the scenes, especially in today's Sanaa. But the basic idea was that MTN was selling its majority stakes in MTN Yemen to an existing minority shareholder named Emerald International Investment, or EII, which was a subsidiary of an Omani conglomerate called Zubair. Next slide, please. Of course, the records tell an entirely different story. And because this commercial activity had some international touch points, it was possible to retrieve some of those records. First, it is worth noting that nearly 30% stake of the Yemeni MNO market was sold to EII for 1 Emirati dirham, or about 25 cents US. This is written very clearly in MTN's documents. It's also important to note that the buyer, EII, does not appear to have any real connection to Zubair, the Omani conglomerate, except for an email address of one of the employees, which is listed under one of the registrations. But in fact, 99% of EII is owned by a company known as Arkan, and the remaining 1% is owned by a Yemeni national known as Marwan Mohammed. Arkan is then owned by 2 Yemeni nationals, the same Marwan Mohammed and his partner in that venture, Abdallah Al-Nagar. If we could quickly move to the next slide to see what the contact info looked like for Arkan, I think it would provide a very clear picture. So as you can see, the registration for Arkan has no street name, has a random building number, which doesn't really mean very much without a street name, has a Hotmail email address, and the phone number listed has a country code that no longer works, since the unification of Yemen in 1990. Obviously, this is a very weak cover story built for the acquisition of a major player in Yemen's telecom industry. Can we go back to the previous slide? Okay. So, in addition to all that, it is worth noting that documents produced by MTN only a few months before the company's departure from Yemen provide no indication that anything is amiss or that they are planning to leave Yemen. But just a few months later, the deal is done and MTN is leaving Yemen and declares that this was actually part of its broader strategy to leave the Middle East and refocus on Africa. So after this transaction goes through, MTN Yemen is rebranded by the new ownership as U Telecom and resumes operations in Sanaa. And I think it's very telling that it resumes operations in Sanaa. Of course, it's often useful to figure out what forces are at play based on who objects to it. And it's worth noting that the government of Yemen objected to the sale of MTN to EII, and then it banned U Telecom from operating in areas under its control, while the Houthis, who are in control of Sanaa, did not say one word about the change of ownership of this asset, which they consider a critical asset. Can we go 2 slides ahead? Okay. So as for the Houthi ability to wiretap calls based on their control of telecommunications companies, I don't have any documents in my possession proving conclusively that Abdulmalik al-Houthi gave the orders to wiretap anyone and everyone, but the interception of unencrypted calls and texts is a standard capability, which any government is able to do with the cooperation of the relevant MNO. This is true for autocracies like Russia and Iran, as it is for democracies like Norway and France, but the difference is that in democracies it requires a warrant. The quotes on the slide indicate anti-Houthi journalists in Yemen suspect that this capability exists and is being abused by the Houthis. Based on my assessment of the Houthis, if they have the capability, they'd abuse it. And if they didn't have that capability for whatever reason, they would acquire it. So this brings us to the next subject, which is Houthi spyware. We can go to the next slide. Recorded Future is a well-known firm dealing with cyber threats, and in May 2023, they released a report on the Houthis. They noted that the Houthis are using weaponized links to target Android-based cell phones. The assessment that the Houthis were behind this activity was based on 2 things. Number 1, who was targeted. These were targets that the Houthis would be interested in. And number 2, the fact that the Houthi-controlled infrastructure belonging to the MTIT, the Ministry of Telecommunications and Information Technology, was being used in the attacks. So I think it makes sense to ask the question, why would they need spyware if they already control the telecommunications companies? There are a few possible reasons or scenarios why the Houthis would still need to use spyware. The first, the targets they may be interested in are using different networks to which the Houthis do not have access, especially if they are located in Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Second, targets on Yemeni networks may be using end-to-end encrypted communications like WhatsApp or Signal, which would mean whatever the Houthis could collect would not be of much value as it would be encrypted. And third, the desired intelligence may have been on the devices themselves, either photos, device camera, device audio. And this is something that wasn't transmitted over the network under Houthi surveillance and therefore wouldn't be available to them. So spyware really has the potential to resolve any of these 3 Houthi intelligence challenges. And despite the clear Houthi involvement in the attacks or the use of the spyware, it's not clear that the Houthis themselves have the ability to create and use these cyber weapons. It's very possible that they've outsourced this to their more cyber-capable allies like Hezbollah or the IRGC. Next slide. So now, when it comes to the internet, the control of this infrastructure has been centralized since the days of Ali Abdullah Saleh. The 2 major players are Yemennet and Tele-Yemen. Of course, because Saleh himself was authoritarian, he also made sure to control whatever information Yemenis could and could not access. It's possible that he did not assign a great deal of importance to this before the Arab Spring, and by then it was too late to save his regime. After Saleh was deposed in 2012, and then the Houthis took Sanaa and deposed his replacement Hadi in 2014, they exerted much tighter controls over the internet almost immediately. I think the fact that they were witness to the Arab Spring, were allied with Saleh, who was supposedly taken down by social media-fueled revolutions, and advised by Iran and Hezbollah, contributed to their prioritization of information warfare and their efforts to tightly control information to which Yemenis were exposed. Next slide, please. So here you can see the immediate changes that the Houthis made to Yemenis' access to information. Israeli websites, domestic independent websites, opposition websites, mainstream news websites, and un-Islamic websites were all made inaccessible by the Houthis. This should present a pretty clear picture of who they see as their enemies in the information war. The answer to that is basically any outlet that isn't controlled by them. It's worth noting that in recent years, they have used the Iranian term soft war to describe the struggle against the penetration of non-Houthi ideas into Yemen. The Canada-based company NetSweeper, whose logo you can see on the bottom left, provided the filtering technology to the Saleh regime beginning in 2010. And so after the Houthis stormed Sanaa in 2014, they just utilized capabilities that were already available when they arrived. Next slide, please. Of course, over time, the Houthis' war on the open internet moved from defense or denying access to offense actively monitoring, and they acquired deep packet inspection capabilities, which enabled them to not only block, but now to more actively or closely monitor and control Yemen's internet. They claim that this is being used in accordance with regulation in order to ensure that legal requirements are appropriately enforced. But of course, knowing how the legal system operates in Houthi-controlled areas, that's not a very convincing claim. Next slide, please. Analysts have suggested that the Houthis seek to strike a delicate balance between limiting their population's access to outside information and enjoying tens of millions of dollars in potential revenues that they can reap from the control of the country's two main ISPs. So as you can see in this graph produced by the Sanaa Center, Yemenis pay more than residents of any other Arab country in terms of dollars per gigabyte for internet. And this is the case despite being the poorest country in the Arab world. In exchange for this jacked up price, they enjoy some of the slowest internet in the world, probably in the bottom five. And this is an excellent arrangement for the Houthis, who managed to provide limited access to an essential service at an exorbitant cost. Next slide, please. So now that we're on the subject of cost, the UN report on this subject sheds a great deal of light on the issue. On the top of the slide, you can see an assessment that the Houthis receive about $160 million per year from telecoms companies. This is an enormous amount in Yemeni terms and may equal around 10% of the Houthis' annual budget, which is estimated to be in the ballpark of $2 billion. Beneath that, you can see an estimate that they are taking over $20 million from each telco, and this may not include the mandatory 1% donation of all revenues that telecommunications companies must make to the Fund for the Welfare of Martyrs' Families, as listed in the second bullet. So in addition to that, the Houthis use their control of the MNOs to send millions of text messages to Yemenis soliciting donation from an impoverished people. Like we said, the GDP per capita stands at $700. And this is like the ones we saw for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which were trying to raise funds from the general public. And in addition to using this tactic to fundraise for Palestinian terror, they also use the same tactic to collect contributions to support their war efforts, whether it's their missile force, their air force. They're using the same text messages in order to raise funds from the public. Next slide, please. So this slide is really more on the policy side of things than it is on the, I guess, technology side of things. But it's more focused, I would say, also on Washington than it is on Sanaa. But what's important about this slide is that it shows that there is definitely a precedent for sanctioning individuals involved in using technology for censorship and to commit human rights abuses. While neither of these executive orders on the slide have been directed at Yemen specifically and instead focus on Iran and Syria, the US government ought to consider sanctioning the entities and individuals involved in exploiting Yemeni infrastructure to advance the Houthis' extremist aims. So the basic idea is there's precedent for sanctioning people who are involved in a lot of what the Houthis are doing, and there may not be the precise executive order we would need in order to sanction the people in Yemen who are abusing the telecommunications industry in order to advance the Houthi cause. But there's certainly precedent in other countries for doing that, and the U.S. should consider I guess, applying similar standards to the Yemeni or to the Houthi issue. Next slide, please. So, while it's essential to punish those responsible for the exploitation of Yemeni telecommunications on behalf of the Houthis, it is also important to avoid steps which would further isolate Yemenis from outside information. They already live in an information bubble created by the Houthis, and further disconnecting them in the outside world will only enhance the Houthis' position as the source of reliable information for the Yemeni public. One of the major opportunities that has been missed, in my opinion, is the creation of alternative telecoms infrastructure, which circumvents Houthi control. Doing so would go a long way in denying the Houthis profit and enhancing Yemenis' access to information beyond Houthi-approved materials, and protecting the Yemenis from relentless surveillance of the Houthi regime. I hope this presentation was useful in clarifying what a strategic asset Yemeni telcos are to the Houthis and why whoever seeks to hasten the decline of this radical group should want to see this issue addressed more seriously. Thank you.